When we were cleaning up from the last network meeting day, we moved everything to the lobby. We had piles of sticky notes, projectors, and chart paper to move to our cars. I really don't like making multiple trips, so I went and grabbed a luggage cart over by the door. Neil said, "You're so resourceful." Thank you, Neil. Being resourceful in that sense sounds pretty easy, but what does it really mean to be a resourceful learner, a key aspect of being an expert learner? What's the difference, for instance, between a resourceful learner and a non-resourceful learner? Let's imagine two math students, a resourceful learner and a non-resourceful learner, approaching a new math problem. How about solving systems of equations? Say they are told to find the values of x and y given the equations 3x plus 5y equals 26 and x minus y equals -2. How they respond is, of course, going to depend on what they have seen in their math class, but it's also going to depend on their resourcefulness and their orientation toward new learning. I think of resourceful learners as the explorers of the learning world. When they approach the boundary of what they know and stare into the chasm of their own ignorance, they are undaunted. They think carefully about what they know already, analyze the problem before them for how it is similar and different. A resourceful learner seeing systems of equations might recall times they have seen equations with two variables, as in linear equations. They may also think of solving single variable equations. The most resourceful learners may begin to manipulate equations, thinking about how to solve for one of the variables. Others might try out a value for x to see what they get. Realizing that value doesn't work out in both equations, they may try a higher or lower value depending on the result. Or they may arrive at a place where they have solved one of our equations in terms of the other variable, say x minus y equals -2, isolating one variable, getting x equals y minus 2. At this point, they may not know what to do with this and consult a reliable expert. Some might go to the textbook for a model, some might find a resource on the internet, and others might go to the teacher and say, "I tried a few values for x and y. I even tried to solve for x in the traditional way, but I end up with a y on the other side. This seems like it could be helpful, but I'm not sure what to do with it. What should I do next?" When a non-resourceful learner reaches the boundary of their knowledge, they may get stuck, not know what to do next, and even throw up their hands, become anxious or frustrated, and stop learning. If the teacher comes around to check in, our non-resourceful learner might say, "I don't get it. I don't know what to do." Not only do they not have a reliable road forward, they don't have a way to relate the current context with prior knowledge, and they have a passive orientation that prevents them from trying out possible solutions with unknown results. They rely on the authority of the teacher or the textbook to give them the information to resolve this particular problem. In just this one example, we can see how important a learner's sense of control over their learning is to their ability to connect a new problem context to prior learning, to transfer learning from one context to another, see patterns and relationships between information, and guide their own processing of new information. In short, resourceful learners clearly understand a particular learning goal, identify what is blocking their learning, and find possible resources both within and outside of themselves to take the next step forward in their learning. For each of us, there's a boundary between what we know and what we don't know. For some learners, the closer they get to the boundary of what they know, the more anxious they get. For others, that boundary is an exciting place to be, our resourceful learners. They feel confident and comfortable that they know how to approach learning what they don't already know. They are, in fact, excited. Like great explorers and adventurers, they walk into the wilderness of ignorance, ready for any situation. They do not go alone. They go equipped with tools, relationships with experts, and prior experience. Pause here and think about your own learning. You could write on your own, interview a colleague, or discuss as a group. Identify a time that you were a resourceful learner. You knew the goal, you identified what stood in your way, and you were able to muster the resources within yourself and outside of yourself to support your learning. What was the context? How did you know you were resourceful? Then identify another context in which you were a less resourceful learner How did you know? Looking back on it now, how would you approach this learning experience differently? So, what do we do to support the development of resourceful learners so that they're able to clearly understand a particular learning goal, identify what is blocking their learning, and find resources both within and outside of themselves to take the next step forward in their learning? In providing multiple representations, our goal is to make new information and learning accessible to the largest possible set of learners. One way to think about the development of resourceful learners is to look carefully at the guidelines and think about what would it mean to gradually invite students to take greater ownership for the checkpoints in the representation principle, especially options for language and symbols and comprehension, which are designed to be a shared responsibility. As students become more flexible and facile at making decisions among the options in front of them, they will develop the skills of recognizing which options work best for them and in what context. Take an example like clarify vocabulary and symbols. There are many practices that invite students into ownership of this aspect of their work. Dictionaries, a glossary section of their notebook, 3 before me. As they develop and use these resources, they will begin to be able to identify that for a particular kind of goal, maybe in a particular subject, or a particular kind of task, they are best served using a written or a video resource. The day to celebrate is when a learner comes to you and says, I could really use a written description of the process for solving systems of equations so that I can easily track the steps. Do you know where I could find one? They have identified that for this kind of goal, which involves multiple steps in the subject of math, they need to be able to simultaneously see all of the steps. Take a few minutes with your team to consider the checkpoints in the representation principle. Break your team into groups or work together to write 3 practices or behaviors that students might engage in if they were to take over ownership of a checkpoint. For example, if your students took on the work of guiding information processing and visualization, what would they actually do? What would they say? What kinds of questions would they ask? Of whom? Pause here and try that out. In order for learners to develop this very focused self-awareness, the learning design will need to be transparent and support ongoing reflection. The learner would need many repeated opportunities to see a relevant goal, choose an approach, try out their approach, gather feedback from peers, receive feedback from an expert, and reflect on what worked and what didn't work for their approach. Integrating all of this feedback into future action defines effective decision-making. Here we can see very clearly how the guidelines are so interrelated. Those checkpoints focused on engagement play a major role in learners developing the decision-making skills to support their development as resourceful learners. After the video, choose one of the guidelines in the representation principle. Take a moment to reflect on and share practices that you use in your classroom already to support learners in taking in and understanding new information and making meaning of new learning. Then choose 2 or 3 practices, either those that you shared or those that you heard from a colleague, and think about how you would take one step toward inviting learners into taking ownership over this work. In one New Hampshire school, I saw a 1st and 2nd grade classroom in which the students, working in pairs, were recording videos of them reading their favorite books. Once they created the video, they created a page with the name of the book, the author, and a QR code. When you scanned the code, it took you to the video of them reading the book. They had created their own digital library of audio-video books for other readers to access. Each learner had also identified their own goals for their work, like make sure I read it smoothly. What's most interesting to me about this example is that the teacher's role is totally transformed. She was more like the manager of a large, complicated project. First, she set an overall goal. Then she had to ensure that each learner had set an appropriate individual goal. She thought carefully about the pairings of teams. She outlined a process for the learners with models along the way. She facilitated collaboration and feedback among the groups. and she intervened with support and feedback when necessary. And finally, she managed the project as a whole toward completion. So, while it remains the responsibility of all of us as the teachers to make sure learners have options in terms of how they access information, we actually stunt the growth of our learners if we do all of the work for them all the time. We need to begin to allow them to exercise their own resourcefulness. We are, of course, constantly balancing this and allowing for the support that all learners will need at some point. By walking this line very carefully, learners will build the skills to explore the frontiers of their own knowledge with confidence. Thank you again for jumping into Module 5, and I'll see you next time.